Our ancient lesson today comes from Psalm 139. The psalmist exalts at the wonder and awe of being lovingly knit together in the womb by a God who cares for us and loves us in every moment. Psalm 139, verses 1 through 18. O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hem me in behind and before and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and night wrap itself around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as day. The darkness is as light to you. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am awesomely and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. That I know very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them existed yet. How weighty to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. I try to count them. They are more like the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. For our modern reading today, Pastor Bob has given us a pair of connected poems about the experience of coming out from the poet Denis Quinteros. Pastor Bob gives us a trigger warning that the second poem contains a description of self-harm. I read these two poems with all the humility of one who has not had this experience, in honor of those who have had this experience. The first poem is called Closeted, the Same Parts. I stand in a dark room filled with fear and resentment. This stems from the idea that speculation of my identity may hurt my well-being. This dark room soon enclosed me for plenty of my childhood and became a sense of need. Hiding felt like chains around my body, but also protected me like armor. I desired to be free, but when I tried to reach the door in front of me, these chains pulled me down onto my knees. I can feel people on the outside trying to look in, their eyes filled with acceptance and protection, but mine were too armored to be vulnerable. They struggled to get inside and see, but I struggled to get out and perceive a new view. A knock resonated from the door, almost as a reminder, an alarm that I would snooze because I was not ready to wake up. A lump in my throat began to build, filled with words I would not have the strength to hold. Everything came up roses, and I threw up a garden. I could only lay in the flowers and say such relieving words, I am gay. The second poem is called Closeted Vulnerability. Vulnerability. Being open meant being free. Being free meant being vulnerable. Vulnerability meant having cuts all over your body that bleed crimson red without restriction. It wasn't pain that I felt from these wounds, but liberation. The same door that compressed me for so long became a new path of life for my future. The first step outside this new path exalted the pure adolescent nature that was embedded into my body. Letting out a deep secret so massive relieved weight on my shoulders that pushed me down as I reached for my truest self. I could look at my reflection and finally recognize the person looking back at me. I was a stranger that I had the pleasure of getting to know. This is what coming out feels like.
Good morning. It's good to be back here. As someone with some spiritual trauma, this has always been a safe space and welcoming space for me, so thank you for having me again. When Pastor Bob said for the modern teaching I could use a poem, I had to go to that one because it's so fitting for the month of June, for Pride. And we're going to revisit here in a few minutes. Last Sunday, I returned from a 3-week trip through Bulgaria and Greece with a group of Washington State University backpack journalism students, 21 of them. It's my 3rd time leading a study abroad program, and each time it so happens to conclude at the beginning of June, which is of course Pride Month. And I hear you guys, as always, had quite the crowd at Pride yesterday, so thank you for doing that. I still remember my first Pride parade. I was in my early 20s. I'll let you imagine how long ago that was. Visiting Columbus, Ohio with my very first girlfriend. Pumping music seemed to bounce off the buildings, and I'd never seen people dance so freely in the streets, as if no one was watching, but I was watching. Rainbows were everywhere, on shirts and hats and shorts and socks, painted on sidewalks, painted on faces, waving from buildings, cars, the back of motorcycles, sticking out of backpacks. People gripped rainbow flags and thrust them high into the air as an athlete would a trophy after a victory. For so long, I had kept my rainbow in my pocket, like a lucky penny, where it was safe and no one could see it, but where I could feel it and knew it was there if I needed it. Because I had learned a different message about rainbows growing up. The rainbow was God's promise to Noah that he would not flood the earth again, and the gays had co-opted it, my mom said angrily. The rainbow was meant to be painted on Sunday school walls and illustrated in children's Bibles, with Noah and his animals happily on the ark, as if the story was about giraffes and elephants and not about death and violence and destruction. In my family home, the rainbow was meant to be a symbol of fear, a reminder of God's wrath, not an emblem of joy and equality. The thought of God's fury, that other rainbow, was what kept me in the closet for so long, through high school and college and into my early 20s, because I was afraid of him. I was ashamed because I was told homosexuals were equal to murderers. They were perverted, and they were weak because they had been deceived by the devil. And worse, I was told the fall of humanity was coming, and it was the fault of homosexuals, as well as the fault of all the allies out there accepting them. So at that very first Pride parade I went to, being surrounded by a queer community for the first time, I found myself digging into my pocket and fishing out my secret rainbow. I felt hopeful, like I belonged. As you may know, the rainbow flag was created in the late 70s by Gilbert Baker, a drag queen and openly gay man. He later said in an interview about the flag, Quote, "Our job as gay people was to come out, to be visible, to live in the truth, as I say, to get out of the lie." A flag really fit that mission because that's a way of proclaiming your visibility or saying, "This is who I am." The rainbow, he added, was a natural flag from the sky. The colors have been modified some over the years, but today you'll see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. Red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, blue for serenity, and violet for spirit. Being swallowed by those bold colors that first Pride almost 20 years ago has always stuck with me. I close my eyes and find strength in those colors when I feel hated or alone. I was out then at that parade, but not boldly and not intentionally. My mom had figured out the coworker I was living with wasn't just my roommate, and told me how incredibly deceived and disappointed she was. She stopped speaking to me. My grandma remained by my side, but said she could not understand. They both said it was a phase and I would grow out of it. Clearly, that didn't happen. Their disappointment enveloped me. I lived in Texas at the time, which did not help. And I found myself looking down when I walked, afraid a stranger might figure me out and be displeased with me also. I didn't feel proud. I felt diffident. Let's revisit the poem, just the first part from earlier. I stand in a dark room, filled with fear and resentment. This stems from the idea that my speculation of my identity may hurt my well-being. This dark room soon enclosed me for plenty of my childhood year and became a sense of need. Hiding felt like chains around my body, but also protected me like armor. I desired to be free, but when I tried to reach the door in front of me, these chains pulled me down onto my knees. I can feel people on the outside trying to look in, their eyes filled with acceptance and protection, but mine were too armored to be vulnerable. They struggled to get inside and see, but I struggled to get out and perceive a new view. A knock resonated from the door, almost as a reminder, an alarm that I would snooze because I was not ready to wake up. A lump in my throat began to build, filled with words I would not have the strength to hold. Everything came up roses, and I threw up a garden. I could only lay in the flowers and say such relieving words. I am gay. For years after that first Pride parade, I continued to keep my sexuality close, telling only those close to me. I worried my students would judge me and feared maybe it would impact my credibility as a journalist. As the poem says, I thought my identity would hurt my well-being, or so I told myself. As the poet Denny Quinteros so rightly said, I let those chains be my armor. After a year or so of my mom learning I was gay, we started talking again, but only over the phone, and only so long as it wasn't about my personal life, and so long as I let her speak about her beliefs, but remained silent about my own. Every time I hung up the phone, I felt small and angry and sad. And this went on for too long, for years, as I moved across Texas to Connecticut and finally here to Washington. Until 2013, when I bought my first home on the South Hill. My mom and stepdad said they wanted to come visit. I welcomed them, but I had some rules. I wanted them to meet my friends, most of whom were gay. And I wasn't going to put away any books about LGBT issues or listen to them talk about their beliefs. We had to agree to disagree. And they chose not to come. instead sending me a letter explaining that because, quote, I continue to disobey God's law, they could no longer be part of my life. They also sent me a UPS package with all of my childhood belongings, including my own baby photos. And just like that, I was erased. And I felt free. Fast forward a few years, and I found myself on my first study abroad trip. I was with 12 students in Israel, and they wanted to go to Tel Aviv Pride. Suddenly, in that moment, I felt an overwhelming need to come out to that group of mostly straight students. Because Pride is fun for all of us, for those in the queer community and for our allies. For some, though, I worry that it can be an excuse for a party, and all the music and drinking and dancing, its meaning can get lost. I wanted them to understand its importance. So as our bus chugged along the highway to one of the biggest Pride events in the world, I walked to the front of the bus and I took the mic, and I told them why I march in Pride. It was the first time I spoke so openly about my sexuality and my personal life to students, and I could feel my hands shake. I explained to them that I go to Pride so I can walk through the streets, knowing that the person next to me has likely also been misunderstood and judged, and maybe even forsaken. We are a community of misfits who for one day get to celebrate that. I told them that I involuntarily came out to my family when I was about their age, in my 20s, and I couldn't come out sooner because I was taught that homosexuality is one of the greatest sins. I had to move far away to even grasp and come to terms with who I was. Some of us, I told them, had to lose our families in order to be out and attend a parade like this. I didn't need to go into detail. They got it. I saw in their eyes that they knew who and what they would be marching for in Tel Aviv. They'd be marching and then singing and dancing for love and also to show acceptance. Now let's look at the second part of that poem from earlier. Being open meant being free. Being free meant being vulnerable. Vulnerability meant having cuts all over your body that bleed crimson red without restriction. It wasn't pain that I felt from these wounds, but liberation. The same door that compressed me for so long became a new path of life for my future. The first step outside this new path exalted the pure adolescent nature that was embedded into my body. Letting out a deep secret so massive relieved weight on my shoulders that pushed me down as I reached for my truest self. I could look at my reflection and finally recognize the person looking back at me. I was a stranger that I had the pleasure to get to know. This is what coming out feels like. I've been very open about my sexuality since that empowering day on the bus, in the spokesman review, in a TEDx talk, in a pivot storytelling contest, and so on. So when in Athens this year, my students wanted to go to Pride, I had no problem reminding them why the day mattered. Especially now, with nearly 500 pieces of anti-gay and anti-trans legislation in the works. We all know that homophobia in our country is rampant right now. Take this column from the Washington Times, for instance, titled, I have issues with this title for multiple reasons, LGBTQ's false religion paints in rainbow colors of sexual anarchy and criminalization of dissent. Robert Knight, a former LA Times news editor, writes, quote, Pride events dominate June, formerly known for weddings and Father's Day. Talk about cultural appropriation. He continues, when you see a rainbow flag draped over a cross in front of a woke Methodist church, it's the equivalent of the Muslim practice of erecting mosques on the ruins of churches. The message is clear. This is captured ground. He goes on to criticize Target for selling Pride swimsuits and Major League Baseball for, quote, caving to LGBTQ religionists, and says queer weddings only borrow the trappings of love. He says enough is enough and uses his Washington Times platform to call for pushback and uprising against queer people as well as our rights. His voice and others like his are loud and are being heard by politicians and nationalists and families like mine who are threatened by equality. We've seen the results of right-wing politicians and media outlets increasingly mainstreaming the use of anti-LGBT plus hate speech in the US. According to the FBI, hate crimes in the US spiked by 35% in 2021, led by a sharp rise in attacks motivated by sexual orientation. Between 2020 and 2021, there was a 54% increase in hate crimes against those in the queer community. I fear what the 2022 and 2023 numbers will look like. This is a strong reminder that we have work to do. These harsh words of intolerance are hurting a lot of people, like my lesbian student whose conservative father refuses to acknowledge her sexuality. My student told me, painfully, coming out never ends. We have to keep doing it over and over again, and no one ever looks at us the same after. So young and already so tired. It shouldn't be this way. In Greece, my students did not end up marching in the Pride Parade, but this is because they had looked up the Pride Parade for Athens, Georgia, not Athens, Greece. So instead, we organized an optional Pride happy hour, and every student showed up. We laughed and we talked, and later some cried. Because voices like Knight's are making more and more people feel like outsiders. Like maybe staying in the closet with chains is the safer place, more comfortable place to stay. But as today's psalm, Psalms 139, 1 through 18 read, even in hiding, God knows who we are and is still with us. In the book, A Life of Unlearning, Anthony Van Brown wrote, every single courageous act of coming out chips away at the curse of homophobia. Most importantly, it's destroyed within yourself, and that act creates the potential for its destruction where it exists in friends, family, and society. We don't need a megaphone or a national news column to make a difference. We make an impact by walking alongside each other in these times, at a pride parade, or to a happy hour, to class, or to church, or maybe to the ballot box. A few times now, my students have become the teachers. They showed me that while so many try to push us down, we can lift each other up. I'm proud of them. I'm proud of me. I'm proud of those who are out and those who are building up the courage to become out. I'm proud of this church for being courageously accepting of Spokane's queer community. Thank you for your love. Now let's take it to the streets and pass it on. Happy Pride.